Good. Well, welcome everyone. This is Book Chat number 3. And I'm thrilled to be, I'm Barbara Mundy. I'm a professor of art history at Fordham University. And I'm thrilled to have been invited to moderate the work of 2 scholars whose work I admire very much. So it's a real pleasure to be here. We will have 2 speakers today who will be talking about recent books. The first, I'll welcome Matthieu Edney, and Matthieu is well known to many of you. He's the Noucher Professor in the History of Cartography at the University of Southern Maine. He's also the director of the History of Cartography project at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The volume that he's edited together with Mary Pedley, Cartography in the European Enlightenment, Volume 4 of the History of Cartography series, is just out, 2019. Congratulations, Matthieu.
Thank you.
He's also known to many of us for his energetic blog, Mapping His Process. And today he will be talking about his newest book, Cartography, The Ideal and Its History, which is recently out from University of Chicago Press. There it is. Matthieu will be presenting for about 5 minutes about his new book, and then we'll be turning to our second speaker to present for also about 5 minutes before we start some conversation about the 2 books and about the future of the history of cartography, or the future of cartography. Our second speaker is Matthieu Noucher, and he is at the National Center for Scientific Research at the Université de Bordeaux. He wrote a 2009 dissertation at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de l'Essonne, and that was titled, I'll give the English translation, Geographic Data at the Borders of Organizations, Socio-Cognitive and Systemic Approach to its Appropriation. In 2017, he published a small book, Les petites cartes du web, and that will be the topic of his conversation today. He's also recently come out with an article, a very interesting article in Cartographica called The Place Names of French Guiana and the Face of the GeoWeb, Between Data Sovereignty, Indigenous Knowledge, and Cartographic Deregulation. I'll be posting all of this in the chat so that if you wanted to follow the thread of that, you will have references there. So I'm going to start by inviting Matthieu to give us a little preview, about 5 minutes of his most recent book. I'll turn the screen over to you, Matthieu. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. So I should be up on the screen. So hi, I'm pleased to be here to talk to you all about this new book. So let me start with something that we all know. Until about 1980, when map scholars thought and wrote about maps, they thought and wrote about these kinds of images. Then a broad movement of scholars, led by Brian Harley, began to give serious attention to other kinds of mapping and to interpret maps as social instruments and as cultural documents. Since then, we have debated the question, what is a map? After 40 years, there is still no resolution. All too often, discussion at interdisciplinary conferences stumbles over this basic question and grinds to a halt. I maintain that we've been asking the wrong question. We should have been asking and arguing about what is cartography. But it seems silly to ask this question. Cartography is the making of maps, right? The nature of cartography is therefore dependent upon the question, what is a map? And here we are, spinning our wheels again. This persistent act of misdirection hides and obscures a fundamental problem. The emperor has no clothes. As the epigraph to my introduction states, there is no such thing as cartography, and this is a book about it. I stole this comment, of course, from Stephen Shapin, who said something very similar with respect to the scientific revolution. Shapin and others have argued that the idea of the scientific revolution is actually a creation of modern writers and is a poor and inadequate lens through which to study the scientific practices of the 17th century. I would go a step further though. Cartography is a simulacrum, which Jean Baudrillard defined as an image that hides not truth, but the absence of truth. Or, put it another way, there's no there. It took me a very long time to realize that cartography is a simulacrum. But eventually I realized that it was impossible to write the book I was trying to write. The idea of that book, which I called An Historical Understanding of Cartography, was to answer the ontological question, how can we understand the nature of cartography such that we can tell its history? And this became a big morass. So I ended up recasting and reworking the book as a history of the idea, of the image, of the simulacrum of cartography. And I must thank Max Edelson and later Katie Parker and Ian Fowler for their constructive help in this process. As published, the book is an expose and history of the ideal of cartography. The first main chapter is a preliminary presentation of the conceptual framework that has allowed me to finally see the imperious nature of cartography. And I present an alternative to the ideal of cartography, which rejects the monolithic endeavor with the multiple spatial discourses within which mapping takes place, and which are the proper focus of empirical study, and the broader heuristic of mapping modes for broader analyses. I then identify the different misunderstandings that modern culture propagates about the nature of maps through the idealized lens of cartography. Some of the preconceptions are contradictory. Their contradictions are exploited in the satires of cartography, such as the idea of a map at 1-to-1. The ideal is a reservoir of preconceptions that are deployed as necessary. So some of the time people insist that maps are pictures, and other times that map making and map using are cognitive acts carried on by individuals, and so on. In the fourth chapter, I explore the many reasons for the emergence of the ideal of cartography, from the proliferation after 1790 of systematic surveys, new kinds of models of vision, like the Colosseum here, via the new field of study called the history of cartography, to the development of personal mobility with bicycles and automobiles after 1890. I then follow the history of one particular concept in detail, the idea of map scale. Yes, people have of course made maps and plans that are proportional to the world since antiquity. Of course they have. And they've expressed that proportionality in several ways. But only in the 19th century was the degree of proportionality specified by means of a single metric, the numeric ratio of map scale, that is then taken as defining everything about any and every map. We can see the rise and consolidation of the ideal of cartography through the history of the adoption of this concept of, I'm using scare quotes, map scale. And I end with a statement about the need to get out of the mindset of even just talking about cartography. There is mapping, many different modes of mapping carried on within particular spatial discourses, and there are the maps that circulate within those discourses, but there is no cartography. Participants in many spatial discourses, notably those engaged in territorial mapping, actively work to make the ideal real. Some map scholars who are themselves participants in such discourses have reacted negatively to my book, thinking that I seek to deny the value of their work. That is not my intent at all. Rather, I seek a way to understand how this kind of detailed, mathematically based, precisely empirical work coexists with other kinds of mapping, without a priori devaluing those other kinds of mapping, and without relying on any of the inadequate conceptions that the ideal of cartography presents as valid statements of the nature of maps and mapping. So, I hope this encourages you to buy or to urge your library to buy book, whether in print or ebook, and the documentation for the code for 20% discount from this and all other University of Chicago Press products, including Volume 4 of the History of Cartography, is in the associated flyer. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew, for that wonderful overview of your new book. I'll now turn the microphone over to Matthieu, who also
trying
has
to figure out how to stop sharing it. There we go.
Who also has a PowerPoint to discuss his new book.
Yes, I will share my screen. Oh, it's okay. So hi, everybody. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a real pleasure for me to be here despite this exceptional situation. So as Barbara explained, I'm a geographer and a GI scientist studying the political and social dimension of the many uses of mapping and geographic information technology. I studied geography in France, then geomatics at Université Laval in Quebec, Canada. And after that, I worked for 1 year for the government of New Caledonia, a little island located between New Zealand and Australia. And it was there that I became aware about the political challenges of cartography. So I decided to do my PhD in Switzerland at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne. And since 2011, I've been working at the French National Center for Scientific Research, CNRS, in Bordeaux in the southwest of France. Nowadays, I have concentrated my research in the area of critical cartography and critical GI science. Critical cartography studies from Brian Hurley, Jeremy Crompton, or Dennis Wood, to give you some famous examples, has been a significant movement for understanding the power of maps, but I argue that the digital transition has not yet been sufficiently integrated by this analytical framework. My hypothesis of such limits is twofold. First of all, we can emphasize that the long focus of critical cartography on the map object makes it difficult to understand complex evolutions, while digital technology makes the old object explode in a series of new representation artifacts. For example, with web mapping, digital footprints, digital Earth, etc. In addition, it can be estimated that critical cartography pays extreme attention to the map of the dominant actors to the detriment of alternative forms, or even cartographic failures far more numerous than one might consider. So that's why I proposed in a small book published in 2017 to focus on what I call the small maps of the web, in French as les petites cartes du web. In this book, I suggest not only to focus in the big cartographic stories, but to also look at all the small maps and counter maps which circulate on the web. As opposed to the great cartographic success stories, I use the expression small maps of the web to mark two perspectives of evolution, historical and political. From an historical point of view, the idea of small maps of the web makes it possible to mark the break between the great cartographic narratives, which have always guided the discipline, and the recent emergence on the internet of diffuse and exponential practices. So the plural of small web maps is important for understanding all their diversity of forms. The expression also makes it possible to underline their political dimension. The politicization of what is small thus leads to considering the small maps of the web as minor maps, that is to say, produced outside the dominant institutional, scientific, or commercial worlds. They then potentially give voice to various minorities and can even become countermaps. So like subaltern studies, it is a question of opening critical cartography on hardly visible corpora and not only on successful cartographic stories. Two case studies conducted in French Guiana on mining activities and on indigenous place names illustrate these proposals and unravel the uses and challenges of Guyanese maps and counter maps circulated on the internet. This little book, only 70 pages, is available only in French, in digital version for less than $8 on the website of the editor, Les Éditions de la Rue d'Ulm, with the link on the screen. And for non-French speaking readers, no doubt numerous behind the screen, I also invite you, if you're interested by this subject, to consult the last issue of Cartographica, the International Journal for Geographic Information and Geovisualization, in which I published this article. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity to point out that I'm currently coordinating the Atlas Critique de la Guyane, a critical atlas of French Guiana, with more than 80 contributors, 300 pages and 400 maps or data viz, which will be published in September 2020 by CNRS editions. The purpose of this book is to deconstruct the preconception ideas on Guyana, preconception ideas which have a long time and are still very widely transmitted by maps. So all these books, all this work, the small books, the article and the atlas, have the same philosophy. They deconstruct the new ways of reading and writing space, which revive the myth of the objectivity of maps and their power to change the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. That was really wonderful presentations, and these are both very exciting books. I'm going to begin with a question to both of you. Matthieu, in your book, you look really at the consolidation of a certain kind of cartography, and you have a wonderful kind of trajectory where you talk about the 18th century as being the ideal cartography prefigured, the 19th century as the ideal emergent, the 20th as the ideal triumphant. Matthieu, on the other hand, against this backdrop of consolidation of cartography, really talks about a kind of unraveling, because in his recent work, he looks at something that he calls the place name flows between the toponyms used by indigenous groups in Guyana and the official French national cartography. And Matthieu points to increasing cartographic deregulation by the creation of things like crowdsourced maps, open street maps. Given this fragmentation that Matthieu is suggesting is happening because of more participatory cartography being available through the web, could you both address what you think the future of cartography, as Matthieu Edney defines it, looks like, given all of these participatory forms of mapping, which, as Matthieu suggests, result in a new kind of cartography?
Matthieu, if I can leap in first. Barbara, thank you for the question. It's a very key question. And as I was listening to Matthieu, and as I've been reading his book, there's a great deal of overlap here, where we're talking around the similar questions. And what Barbara doesn't mention is that in the conclusion, as I'm trying to wrap up the book, and I talk about the 18th century as the ideal prefigured, and then ideal emergent, the ideal triumphant in the 20th century. The 21st century I describe as the ideal degenerate. That this is the period when the ideal is actually breaking down, and has been for some time. And so I really very much see what Matthieu is talking about as the rise of the web, the rise of participatory mapping as in effect, a return to pre-modern practices in a way of a sort of the breakdown of the institutions that arose in the 19th, 20th century, and a return to different kinds of circulation of material, whether virtual or physical. I think that makes sense.
Yes, but you're ascribing to a certain kind of historiographic trajectory, which might be familiar to many of us. Matthieu, would you ascribe to that same kind of consolidation and then fragmentation as a model of historical change, of specifically cartographic change?
Yes, I'm agree. I think from Nancy Peluzzo's work in 1995, it seems that contour mapping has largely developed in very different forms with the digital transition, with a crowdsourcing system and the development of geo-collaboration. So there's I think there's a fragmentation, a big diversity of maps, and this cartographic tales is accelerating today. As from my point of view, we have entered in a period of what we can say a post-informational sovereignty. You know, in France, for example, the French National Institute of Cartography, IGN, is in a frontal concurrence with a lot of local cartographic system. So maybe it is very important to have a reflection about the sovereignty and the cartographic sovereignty today.
Right. Yeah.
And I have another lap with Matthieu, but in French, you know, there is a semantic difficulty, because Matthieu makes the difference because cartography and mapping, but you know, in French, it's the same word. You know, we don't have a difference between mapping and cartography, and that's why in my small book, the subtitle I use the term fabriques cartographiques, so mapping process, in order to explain the difference between cartography and mapping. And I'm totally agree with Matthieu, but in French, it's this idea is very hard to explain, you know.
Yes, because in Matthew's, one of the quote from his book is that the actual behavior, what people do, is mapping, and that idealized behavior, what people think they do, is cartography. So that will pose a challenge for your translators, Matthieu, when your book is translated into French.
Yeah, one of the reviewers pointed out that point as well. And I don't know French enough to be able to make any kind of suggestion. Yeah. I'm open.
I'd like to invite, if anybody has a question, if you could put that in the chat, I will pose it to the participants. I have one coming in from Ricardo Padran, and he's asking Matthieu Edney a question. To what extent is the story of the cartographic ideal a story of the institutional location of cartography? For example, in state-sponsored cartographic offices. And
in Chicago?
Actually, yeah, and I would ask Matthieu to think about that too, because his work has something to say about that. Yeah.
Thank you. It's not just a question of certain privileged institutions that have created this concept and then disseminated it out. It's a very widespread array of factors that go through chapter 4, from yes, the development of state mapping and topographical surveys and cadastral surveys and hydrographic surveys and so on, leading all the way up to present day remote sensing and aerial photography before that. But it's also factored in, the other factors include the rise of personal mobility, of people using maps instrumentally and testing them against the world. It's the development of set theory in mathematics, in where mathematicians start to take the idea of a mathematical transformation between different data set, different dimensionalities of data, and starts to call them, first of all, a projection. Thank you, Carl Friedrich Gauss. And then by the end of the 19th century, into a map, generally speaking, which then gets reinforced in how the public think of, these mathematically trained people think about what maps are as transformations. So it's not just the rise of the explicit institutions, it's the whole rise of the culture of modernity, which is not just a government-driven thing. I mean, it's not this juridical power of Foucault. It's more the power of knowledge. Is everybody sharing within this knowledge, and as everybody is sharing in the products being generated by the institutions. They're using topographic maps to go orienteering and go bicycling and so on. They start to develop this larger body of ideas and sort of imbibe it as part of a cultural move, not as a top-down or sideways, whatever, institutional move. I think that answers your question.
Yeah, and I'd like to actually turn to Matthieu to address that question of the place of mapping. Is not the story of a cartographic ideal also the story of the institutional location of cartography? Because your work actually posits that there are other kind of locations of cartography that are producing their own counter narratives. I think Matthieu, I think we've lost you. Are you frozen there? I think he is.
He is.
Okay.
Well,
all right.
I mean, I would answer exactly that point. There's always been multiple venues of mapping. There's the formalized institutional, and there's everything else, which is huge. Even in 19th, 20th century, there's lots and lots and lots of other kinds of mapping by other peoples. And as Matthieu says, they are marginalized in various ways. So it's really, it's a cultural mindset more than an actuality.
Yeah. So I'm going to interject with a question from Carla Luis to Matthieu.
Hi, Carla.
She asks, she says, you're saying cartography is a simulacrum. Are not maps also a simulacrum?
Very good question. It is going to depend on the kind of map, in the sense that the map hides the truth, or the fact there is no truth. I don't think the works of a modern topographic survey would be a simulacrum in the sense that you can use those maps instrumentally and successfully. There is a truth to the world, and within the framework of how the map was made and the intended uses, there is a truth in there. And as such, it's not really a simulacrum. It is a partial image. It's a very dedicated, mediated image, absolutely. But there is a truth behind the map. If there wasn't a truth behind the map, we wouldn't be making the maps. So maps themselves, I don't see as simulacra, but the conception of cartography, yes. And we can talk about this more, I'm sure.
Yeah. I want to alert people that session 5 will be beginning. So people who would like to, we can continue our conversation a few more minutes, but for people who would like to exit and join that session, that will be starting now. So Francis Harvey has a very good question. I'd like to throw it to you. And that
Hi,
is,
Francis.
maps make the world. Does institutional mapping create the performance of truth?
Yes, it does. Performativity of truth is a really good concept. Thank you. I'm going to steal that from you, maybe.
Problem.
Francis came up with a great quote, which I'm still thinking about, the miracle of mysticism of the cartographic miracle. Yeah, I think the way in which people relate to modern topographical maps, for example, there's a clear binary between the idea of the map as something that needs to be truthful, and if it's not, then at least for the last 2 centuries, it's classified as a non-map or a map-like object. And in fact, I was going to say earlier, I mean, there's this in the 20th century, there's this huge body. I know them in America, but I know they're in Europe as well and elsewhere, of popular and pictorial maps, which have lots of cartoonish icons, around which a whole new name gets created by taking the word cartography and in English dropping off that last Y, as in photography to photograph. A cartograph becomes the product of cartography, but it's not a real product, and it's specifically coined for those maps that aren't truthful in the way that a real map should be. So there's a way of negotiating what is true through the mapping themselves.
Great. Okay. Well, I'm sorry we don't have Matthieu has disappeared into the ether. I'm sorry he can't be here to offer his rejoinder. And let's see if there's any other questions. Francis Harvey's been putting some nice questions in the comment. Are there any other questions that we'd like to ask Matthieu Edney before we close? Great.
Thank you.
Super. Well, I wanted to thank everybody. This is wonderful to be together, although virtually. Thank you for your attention. The information of the books is in the chat. If you'd like to acquire them yourselves, you'll find the bibliography in the chat. And I'm looking forward to seeing some of you at the other meetings this afternoon.
Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you, Matthieu.
And thank you, Matthieu, in absentia.
Yes.
Right, I'm going to go over there.
Right. Queen,
Yeah.
you want to finish the show?
I'm not host anymore, so I don't think I can
yes,
end
it's
it for
Barbara.
all.
Shall I turn off?
Okay.
Yeah, there's like, when you press leave, it'll say like end for all. And then
Yeah.
it'll
Okay.
just
Super.
go away.
Bye.
Have a good day.
Thanks a lot. Bye, everybody.